Should I just start? Yeah. Hi. My name is Natalia Gumenyuk. I'm a Ukrainian journalist and author and filmmaker, and in particular the author of the book The Lost Island, The Tales from the Occupied Crimea. And this is the talk I want to share with you on what's going on there now, what is my experience, and in fact, as the title of the talk says, why we should care more about Crimea. I'm glad to join and to talk to the American audience, in particular because Crimea looks and is so distant. However, what we try to explain that the story of the occupation of Crimea is universal. And that's what I'm trying to explain in the book, first of all. You heard the word occupation. It's, there is a lot of geopolitics about that. However, sometimes it's missed that this occupation of the peninsula in 2014 happened in our time. And it's not something historic. And it's universal because we can speak about this story. What happened if all of a sudden the country you live is, or the place you live is occupied? It's not the fiction movie, but what if all of a sudden, within a couple of weeks, the state you are isn't any longer the state you used to live, the laws are different, and any connection to the state you used to be could be the part of the risk. What if the language you used to speak had become all of a sudden a sign of dissent? What if you've been to some you had some healthcare issues, you've been to some program, and it just banned in this new territory, or your religion is under the threat, and it's happening really on within a couple of months. And that's what where Crimean population had found itself in 2014. It's a bit striking how those things had been normalized in public understanding, both in Ukraine and globally, but I still think we haven't comprehended that fully. So it's about everybody, and that is the way as well how I want, as an author and somebody who was and is still focusing on reporting from Crimea, reporting on what's going on in Crimea, want to see this story. In this talk or a workshop, of course, I want to speak more about the current situation, about situation with the indigenous population of the Crimean Tatars, what's happening with the languages, whether the occupation of Crimea is feasible, and why it all happened, and how the international, what was the international reaction? Was it enough? Starting with answering the title of the talk, I want to say that why we should care, maybe because if we do not do that in 21st century, that's quite a sign that the whole overarching international legal system, the whole idea of the defense of the human rights is a bit it's useless. What else I want to tell in the book, that how it's to be a human who all of a sudden has to become a political activist, all of a sudden has to fight for the life of your beloved people, of your husband, son, as it happened to many Crimean residents who has become what we know today, the families of the political prisoners. So, because many people think that political prisoners, especially if they live in a democratic country, or those people, they are some unusual people who are, I don't know, maybe they are just different. Yet this story of Crimea shows us that it happened that the normal people can be in such circumstances, and they have all of a sudden become the political activist, as it happened, for instance, to the mother of Kolchenko, of Sasha Kolchenko, who has been imprisoned in Russia for a few years, for almost 7 years. And his mother was a shopkeeper who never cared about politics, but had to become somebody who done a one-person protest in Crimea. So I've traveled to Crimea many times. I'm not from Crimea, yet yet I happened to be in the it wasn't like I happened to be, but I went to the peninsula at the moment of the annexation, started to report in March 2014, and went on traveling to Crimea till more or less the COVID times. Since then, it's very difficult for the Ukrainian reporters, but at all to many people to get to the peninsula. It was possible, I should also say, that, however, a few people were going on. So I've gradually observed how the situation had been changing. And the most striking thing was how abrupt was this loss of freedom back then, still in 2014, when still on Sunday or Saturday, people were on the square protesting against occupation, but that was a day before this so-called referendum, and then they had become silent, and then they wanted to talk to you just maybe on, they want to meet you as a journalist to tell their story on Monday. On Tuesday, they would be afraid to meet in person, so they would prefer to speak on phone, and on Wednesday, they maybe would be not willing any longer to speak to you at all. That's how fast it has happened. Now we have the situation when we have 100 political prisoners behind the bars in prisons of Crimea and in Russia. They are mainly Crimean Tatars, and that process started not right during the annexation, but closer to 2015. There were 12 people, 12, 20 people, 25, 30, and those people were charged mainly with extremism and the terrorism with no reason. That's I can more or less be very sure about those cases, because a lot of human rights defenders can prove that. The allegations are used in order to just to frighten the most active members of the community. Some of the people are charged with 20 years imprisonment, as the whole idea is to alienate somehow the Crimean Tatar population. There are 300,000 Crimean Tatars living in Crimea, and they're indigenous people. They are Muslim by their religion. So somehow Russia, who has a history of the Islamic radicalism, more or less moved a lot of security experts and security law enforcement from the Caucasus, from Chechnya, from Ingushetia, from Dagestan, who imposed this idea of the Islamic fundamentalism just to alienate this obviously this population which was resistant to the Russian occupation. So somehow this problem has become created, and it become way more difficult to also what is tricky in this situation, that despite there are great human rights defenders in Crimea who are there, who are going to the courts, who are trying to fight for those people, yet still this connection with the Muslim minority has created a lot of concerns on the international levels. Some people are not really sure what's going on there. What if they are really connected to any kind of extremist movement or so? Yet it's very, very important to explain that the Crimean Tatar resistance movement, which has been active during the Soviet time, was a member of the Helsinki Committee, a human rights movement. Those people were really raised in the tradition of the peaceful protest and non-violent resistance. And in the history of the Crimea after the Ukrainian independence, there was never one political case of the terrorism or terror attack till now. Now the situation has become way more critical, in particular because of COVID. I explained that I couldn't really travel to Crimea because of the COVID and Russia considered Crimea to be its part of the land, you need to have a family member to travel there. And if you want to get out of Russia, you also need to have a reason. Either you have a residence permit in a different country, or you have somebody from your family living in another country. So if still, despite of everything, the movement between people was possible, because Ukrainians do not need to have visa to Russia, Russians don't need to have visa to Ukraine. So, and those 2 million of people residing in Crimea, they all have the relatives in the Ukrainian mainland. It's like many of them, it's one country. So they've been traveling. So this connection was still there, yet due to COVID for more than a year, it's almost non-existing, which had a huge impact. As well, the whole demands of the international human rights defenders to free at least those people who are behind the bars and who risk health, who are in critical health condition because they're in the risk group, because they're maybe elderly, and being in prison is something critical. They are still not freed. What is also, in this workshop for me, maybe there is no need to explain, everything, to retell the history of the Crimea, of Crimea of the last 7 years. Yet, and I feel often while speaking in different platforms that there is some kind of Crimean fatigue, in a way that everything has happened in 2014. What new can be learned? Still, within the last year, quite a few new things had popped up. First of all, the most important, we have already a new generation which had grown up in occupation, for whom Ukraine is a distant place. Imagine the kids who were 7, now they are 14. They've been brought up in Russian schools. Honestly, even here in Kyiv, where I'm now, the youngsters, among my generation, there is everybody who has been in Crimea. It's a beautiful part of the land. It's a resort. Yet now there are those kids who do not know how is it to travel, what is Yalta, what is this, seashore, and how it's to have holidays, which is a usual things for every Ukrainian family. The new challenges has come also with an environmental damage, which had been which hasn't been still properly researched, but there is a lot of space for that. Connected to the lack of the water in Crimea, the problem is that there were always the Crimea is dependent on the water from Dnieper River, but despite of that, despite that, there are new pressure. Since the last years, there are many residents of Russia who were invited to move to Crimea from different towns, from Siberia, from anywhere. There is no difference if you buy a flat, if you have a mortgage somewhere in Irkutsk or Yalta. So why not to move there? Now we're speaking about around 500,000 people who've been moved to this part of the land. The population of Crimea is 2 million of people. So if 500,000 people arrived, it's quite a huge pressure on the towns on the bigger towns like Sevastopol or Simferopol. Most of the people in the law enforcement are Russian, so their families are moving. And since then, it was not so visible in the very first days of the annexation, but now the new resident, new kind of resident buildings had been built. It was not planned for that many people, so it's created pressure on the infrastructure. So there is a lack of water, there is a dry of some lakes. Sometimes the, near the Bakhchisarai is a place where there is strong and bigger Crimean Tatar community historically. The lake is drying because somehow the rivers are moved in order to fulfill these needs of the people who are moved to the capitals of this, to the Crimean capital. So this is the new reality, which I think the international community can learn more and know. There is always new things, and apart from things which has happened in 2014, apart from human rights issues and the violation of the human rights, the long-lasting effect is already there. That's something we can speak 7 years after. At the moment, answering the question about the situation of the Crimean Tatar, which I want to explain, many of those who following or at least know something about Crimea might know that, of course, there was this famous historical tragic case of the deportation of the whole Crimean Tatar population in 1944 by Stalin. The Crimean Tatars were accused at that time on collaboration with Nazism. However, still few people know that how important is this story of a one man who can change the history of the whole nation at that time, how this story can be used. Few people remember and know that these allegations, not truthful allegations against Crimean Tatars, were done by the head of the Soviet partisans, Soviet rebellions against Nazi. The guy had a huge the name of that person was Makrausov, and he was the leader of the Soviet rebellion, yet he was the one who somehow undermined the Crimean Tatars rebellion. He failed in Crimea and made Crimean Tatars as a scapegoats of that, that as if they were the collaborators. However, among the Russians, and there were proportionally, there were even more collaborators. That was discovered still during the Second World War. Makrausov had been kind of fired. However, that was used as a pretext to move at that time up to 200,000 people to the Central Asia. 1/3 of the Crimean Tatars died during the deportation, yet that was mainly Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. What was interesting and also often is not known, that after the Stalin death, some other nations such as Chechens and Ingush or Kalmyks, they were allowed to come back to their to Crimea, to their mainlands, to their lands, to Tatars, to Dagestan or to Chechnya. Yet Crimeans were not allowed to move to Crimea by the end of 80s. Yet the strong Crimean Tatars movement had appeared, and they were going to Moscow. They were trying to go back to Crimea. They were deported again. There were laws and bills then adopted which forbidden Crimean Tatars to get registered in Crimea even if they moved. And those laws had been even created in the end of so-called perestroika, in the end of 80s. So that's created, and also now currently I'm also working on the documentary on the return of the Crimean Tatars, which is also a very interesting part of the chapter in the history, which would be very interested for academics to research more, as few people understand that there was no so-called glasnost in Crimea in 90s. Into Crimea there were always way more control. from the Kremlin. There were, for instance, to the city of Sevastopol, there were a lot of military move. There were a lot of heads of so-called NKVD and different kind of law enforcement and security services. Families moved, so that was a very, very nice piece of land. And even when I'm talking now to the journalists who lived in Crimea in 80s, they would say that the Crimean Tatars the papers in Crimea, when still there was some freedom in 19 end of 80s, there were some criticism of the Soviet Union. Back then, they were full of the threats that Crimean Tatars would come. They are rapists, they are criminals, they are extremists. And when I talked to so many Crimean Tatars about the way how they returned, everybody has the case that they heard those papers. Also, there was a state policy, so police was policemen were going to the houses of the people and telling that be careful. So it created the culture when, for instance, the whole system, the whole law enforcement is against a particular ethnic group, which is not a minority, but which is the indigenous population. Still, there is a lot to speak about that, but we can really say that at least within the 90s and up to the occupation, that situation has been somehow normalized. We cannot say that Ukraine was the very generous, but Ukraine was, though even it was tough before our previous presidents like Yanukovych, there was always still some, let's say, people who were communist and just changed their party tickets to the, and had become the Ukrainian civil servants. They were still in their hearts and minds anti-Crimean Tatars often. There is discussion, could it be different? Some people would argue that was the price to pay also for Ukraine not to kind of radicalize the situation, because on the contrary, of course, in different republics of the Soviet Union, in Georgia, in Moldova, there were wars going on. In Crimea, there was never war. There were different things, but there was no really this kind of violence. So was it the case to leave those communists in power in 90s? Yes, that was the answer of the Ukrainian government, of the President Kravchuk and later Kuchma. There were a lot of things done wrong. Yet when we speak today, indeed, the 2000s were already when I've been, in my book, I've talked to a lot of teachers of the Ukrainian language who said that, like, our kids, if in mid of 90s, they maybe wouldn't know Ukrainian, which was not really taught in Soviet Union, there was no issue. People were trilingual. They can speak Crimean Tatars, they can speak Ukrainian, and they already felt as a part of Ukraine. Yet, what was interesting for me, if to speak about the Ukrainian language, one of the chapters in my book is about the situation of the Ukrainians in Crimea. And for me, it was again a striking experience. I grew up already when Soviet Union was almost gone. For me, there was never anything precious about speaking Ukrainian. It was just normal. I went to the school to learn Ukrainian. I can speak. I never felt anything by speaking Ukrainian in Ukraine. And one of the times when I went to Crimea, first times I was coming in myself very often, just myself. So I would, of course, I wouldn't speak to anybody. Yet once when I went with my cameraman, and we have this habit of speaking Ukrainian in between of us, I understood that it felt like you were a dissident. If you speak in a Ukrainian in the street of Crimea, the Ukrainian is a kind of sign of dissent. Because also by the current policy, you can still admit that, okay, Crimean Tatars is a different ethnic group. They speak, their language is different. it's from the group of the Turk languages. They are Muslims, but being a Ukrainian is not it's a political position, as if it's your choice. Somehow the official position is that there is no Ukrainian. Ukrainians are those who just do not want to admit that they are the same. So in this regard, this very, very modest and humble kind of club of Ukrainian speakers in Crimea who gather together in sometimes for some holidays to commemorate some famous Ukrainian poet or poetess, they felt like dissidents. And for me, is again sound like coming back to maybe something I read in the books where of this 19th or even 20th or even 19th century, when going to the monument of Taras Shevchenko, a famous Ukrainian poet, on his birthday is a sign of resistance. As well, for me, that was exactly shocking, and that's what I'm also writing a lot, that I couldn't imagine that in 21st century the people would be sent to Siberia. And that is a case. And that was a case of Oleg Sentsov, of Alexander Kolchenko, and the others. There were a few questions on the why things had happened in 2014 as they happened. And here I want to remember the story which I heard from Professor Kuramia, who invited me for partly also for this talk, when he was in Ukraine, and he was giving me example from his studies, how once, I don't want to be mistaken, but it was the still during the Tsarist Empire, when there was the wars in China, there were some decrees for the Russian officials saying that, like, okay, when there is a mess in China, when there is some kind of local war or something, we can grab a part of Manchuria, we can grab a part of the land grab part of the land when the other country is weak. And that strategy has been used in 2014. The Maidan revolution for me is the whole attack on Crimea, but also the war in the Donbas. That was not the result of the Maidan. For me, this is the counter-revolution. There was a distraction, because the Maidan was very positive case of rebellion against the police impunity, against the unlawful corrupt state, which could inspire something like that in Russia, or first of all in Russia. As well, we should remember 2014, that was more or less still the period of the Arab Spring, which I remember, and that felt like, the dictator, the strong dictator like Gaddafi or somebody can fall. So the narrative of the Kremlin was like, do not go to the street, otherwise there will be war. But the point is that, like, we would create the war if you go. And that would happen in Crimea in 2014. Yet, can the deoccupation start? Is deoccupation possible? I do not buy for the argument of many who say that, like, oh, we can remember the Baltic states. We can remember the Baltic states. They were occupied by Soviet Union in after the Second World War. We never recognized them. And when the Soviet Union had fallen, they had become independent, and it lasted for 40 years, so you should be patient. As I started my talk, the time is not on our side. And also, we understand that things are happening way faster. Maybe we understand how fast the situation is changing anywhere, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Central Asia. So sometimes there are those black swans in history when things are just changing. The world is faster. So just to wait for 30 years, might not be, there should something happen. There is always an opportunity. Of course, it depends a lot on who is running the Kremlin. In our case, of course, it depends whether Vladimir Putin in his seat. Yet still things might happen. As we are more open, the population still, despite we can't travel, there is no Iron Curtain. So and still modern Russia is not the Soviet Union. And when we look also at the resistance of the Crimean Tatars since 1950s till the end of Soviet Union, there were more tougher situation. The situation was tougher. Soviet Union was stronger. Of course, the situation in the West isn't easy as well. I wonder whether it's formidable for the Crimea and the occupation. I remember very well how in 2014, how cautious was the West with the answers. And I also remember that how much Ukrainian journalists, not just Ukrainian journalists, many journalists and international experts who were following Crimea had how many times, first of all, had to spend to explain what are fake news, what is this phenomenon, to explain that there were not little green men but Russian military in Crimea. Yet when I had a chance to talk to the General Breedlove, who has at that time a commander of the NATO allied troops, which I also mentioning in the book, and I asked, like, you were the head of the allied troops at the moment of the occupation. Did you know that there were not little green men, there were Russian soldiers? And he said, like, yes, from the first moment we knew. NATO knew that. It just some of the members of the alliance weren't really ready to say that aloud. I remember traveling to the US, speaking at the conferences anywhere to prove that there are Russian troops in Crimea, which I think that it was a huge waste of time. Now there is no need to explain what is propaganda, how people can all of a sudden believe to nonsense. How can politicians, high-profile politicians and the head of state speak about, create a parallel reality, invent the stories, promise something which is not feasible. But now there is no need even for me at this seminar to speak a lot about propaganda and the fake news. Yet a lot of time had been wasted. And by the way, again, for me now it's interesting to research the archive on the 80s and see that happened also in the end of 80s. So that are the things which I think were missed. And for me, it's also very important to underline that, you know, a lot of international pressure is still possible. And I'm not here, it's an academic talk, I'm not an advocate. But I should also say that it's interesting how also they are important, the calls to free political prisoners in case of Crimea by the leaders of the state. But it's interesting to follow that they do not matter. The calls from Macron, the French president, directly to Putin to free somebody, didn't influence at all. There was no freeing of the political prisoners. They were mainly exchanged to the different people by the negotiation of the Ukrainian state. A couple of few things, because I think that there is a lot I've covered already about the Soviet pro-Russian nostalgia, how it survived for 2014. It's not a Russian nostalgia. That was Soviet nostalgia. It's very easy to imagine some other country and the things are good there if you don't live there. It happened that a lot of Crimeans believed that, you know, the Russia is still the Soviet Union where you have jobs, where you, do not pay much taxes, where you have a planned economy or so. And after that, while talking to the people, you understood that, Russia is a capitalist state. It's not the socialist state. You have the insurance. You need to buy an insurance to have a health care. Recently, I've been also talking to the Estonian journalist who have been traveling to Crimea, and we discussed it a lot. And he is based in Russia, but he's ethnic Russian, but working for Estonian media. And he also said that he was surprised that in Crimea, when he traveled there, how somehow this island, which has become a gray zone, a type of Transnistria, Abkhazia, or Nagorno-Karabakh, has managed to take the worst out of both states, of Russia and Ukraine. And if Ukraine is chaotic and messy sometimes, the Russia is tough with its law enforcement, but in that regard, you maybe can have your business, and maybe you do not pay all taxes, and it's not everything is, but you won't get in prison into that, or there won't be the policeman who would run this place, and the corruption wouldn't be that organized. So now you get a kind of Ukrainian messiness still, and the Russian toughness in this. But what I want to end this talk is about the hope. I'm still coming back. I'm not traveling last year, as I explained, to Crimea, but anytime I talk to the people there, I'm very hopeful. For me, this is the example of Crimean solidarity, such initiative. I told about 100 political prisoners. They are mainly male. All of them altogether have up to 200 kids. Who now living with their mothers. And since 2014, it's impossible to send money to Crimea via the usual systems from Ukraine. But those people managed, being inside of Crimea, collect money. So every single month since 2016 already, for the 6th year, every kid is receiving a round of $100 every month. And this is an incredible example how the people can self-organize for 6 years to play this role of the state and pay the money and have this system. So I do have this talk. And for me, this is the good sign. I also can answer the question which I often answered after my book has been published, especially for the people outside of Ukraine and especially in post-Soviet republics or the Baltics, who said like, yeah, but the pensions are higher, maybe the economic situation is somehow better. Russia indeed sent a lot of money to Crimea. If we buy to this argument, we may say that just by paying a bit more, and first of all, this is about the civil servants. It's enough of reasons to occupy this part of the land, which is again for me nonsense that every richer country, if we buy to this argument, has the right to occupy a poorer country just because they can pay a better pension or better wages. And that's for me something I think we should consider. So with this, I want to end the talk. I'm happy to answer the questions. I probably want to address maybe a few on Crimean platform in particularly. That's something different. So I didn't want to combine it with my talk, as I more wanted to base about this experience, which which I needed to, what I tried is a bit to update you with the recent last years, what has developed, but also not to just retell what is in my book, but maybe to touch some of the most important stories. And maybe by this, despite of all these cases of the Crimean Tatars and the others, you might feel that this is a universal story. This is happening now. This is not a history. And I cannot agree that it can't be undone.
Thank you so much, Natalia. At this point, we welcome comments, and questions, you can type those either in our chat or in our Q&A option. And I would like to mention again that Natalia Gumenyuk is the author of The Lost Island, Tales from Occupied Crimea. This book was based on 6 years of her reporting. And Natalia is also the author of Maidan Tahrir, In Search of Lost Revolution, which was also based on her field reporting on Arab Spring. And this book was published in 2015. So please submit your comments or your questions. Natalia, I just have a very quick question, which is based on one of your comments that you made. You said that right after 2014, you were attending conferences and you were getting talks at international events, and you felt like it was a waste of time. How so?
As I said, that now I understand that there was no need to prove that that there were Russian troops, that there was effective Russian control. That was obvious for everybody. And by the way, we have today the decision of the European Court of Human Rights to say that the Russia had been the occupation of Crimea. Russia has been effectively occupying Crimea since 26th of February 2014. So that's proven in the law. That's not any longer the question. Of course, that is the need to explain the story, to tell the story, but and maybe if we didn't started to explain what are the fake news in 2014, by 2017 or 2018, we would lose some time. So some things were probably not fully useless.
I really appreciate the way you talked about Crimea back in the 90s, and then you also mentioned that, and that's absolutely correct, that now we have a generation who doesn't know what it means to have Crimea as an available, let's put it this way, as an available place for traveling. And I'm wondering how Crimea is presented to the Ukrainians today. I know that the title of your book is Lost Island, and there is some conversation about this kind of representation of Crimea in terms of an island. It looks like it's something that is distant, it's something that is somewhere there, which is not really connected with the mainland. However, Crimea is a peninsula, but not like a real island. But I know what you mean in your title of the book. Of course, it's a metaphor, but still, it somehow triggers conversations around this term. And you also touched upon the way the Crimea was presented in the collective memory, where, again, in the 90s, for some reason, the policy didn't really invest into the incorporation, full incorporation of Crimea into, let's say, Ukrainian memory or Ukrainian context. And maybe to some extent, it was some sort of a failure in the 90s. And today, there are a lot of films, there are a lot of books which are based on Crimea, either the recent events or the past events, and in this way, it's somehow reintegrated into the collective memory of Ukraine. So, can you share a couple of comments on how the Crimea is reintegrated in the collective memory of Ukraine today?
I often, I'm quite often in the same event with Rifat Chubarov, who is currently the head of the Crimean Tatars Mejlis, which represent Crimean Tatar population. And I always like how he put it. He knows a lot what has been done wrong, but he always says that it can't be connected and it can't be an excuse. A lot of wrong things, but were done by the Ukrainian state in 90s towards different groups of population. Today, as I said, I'm working on particularly on the documentary on the return of the Crimean Tatars, and I often ashamed by kind of the not knowing that there was this discrimination on the human level. Yet we understand where it's going when we started to read still the Soviet papers. And I do not think that, more could be done. It's rather than not to put a blame on somebody in the 90s. It's about changing the discussion how we knowing that there were things which can't be which can be improved. What can we do next? So while talking to some famous Crimean Tatars, actors who we now working, they also say that somehow, unfortunately, because of the war, Ukrainians had understood Crimean Tatars. They just understood. They didn't know their their problems. And now it's a time. And in the end, I think we also didn't think back then how connected the country should be, how to find these connections. As for the current idea of the Crimea, I think that I was often surprised how quite a few people told me, we can't read the book, we can't read anything, and they were not from Crimea, about anything because it's traumatic. It's traumatic. I don't know, I always sometimes meet the people who say it's traumatic, we don't want to have it. I think always that it's a part of our responsibility, though it's traumatic, we have to know that. Yet the problem is with the powerlessness. Without, like, we do not know what to do. The powerlessness is the blocks the imagination. And I think my idea with the book, with what we are doing, is to break this cycle, to change the discourse of what just remembering how it was before 2014, but reimagining this talk, reimagining the conversation, that it doesn't leave us with the idea that nothing could be done. So, for instance, now I'm really welcoming this appearance of the idea of the Crimean platforms, for whom, for many, it sounds something vague. To explain it super simple, that would be the summit to the summit of the Crimean Tatar platform, where the Ukrainian state is invited different kind of politicians and the leaders of the states to kind of sign a memorandum on the non-recognition policy, but also it's the coordination between different groups, experts, academians, and everybody, to understand what we can do, in effect, and discussing it. Oh, there are new things happening because of the environment. Maybe we can do something with that. Okay, some countries, somebody are not interested in security in the Azov Sea. Some care about human rights. Some care about religious minorities. Some think about maybe it's really the support of the Crimean culture. Maybe there is something connected to the COVID-related issues due to the occupation. So can we coordinate between us? What are those simple things which are feasible to do, and what are in fact the discussion, which is what are the legislation which should be maybe adopted, what can be done on international level, what can be in local. And when we started to talk, it sounds we can do a lot, even like discussing, when I listed the drafts and drafts of those documents, of the ideas, even the idea that some of the scholars might have the fellowship, international fellowships to study Crimea, that could be something, these kind of the ideas. We do know that there are, if there would be an opportunity for an American academician or student or somebody who is doing PhD to get a grant and research more about something very interesting, about the case how you train the police to be against a particular ethnic group. Isn't that something interesting? Of course it is. So I do think that those things might be interesting. And this is, the more you learn, the more fascinating it is how much we can do on every single level, and how indeed a universal this story is.
Indeed, the deoccupation of Crimea is, of course, is one of the, let's say, domestic priorities, but Ukraine also relies on international communities a lot. And when we speak about international communities, there is another narrative with which Ukraine has to deal with, which is the Russian narrative. And Russia, of course, has a very powerful mass media machine. And I think, again, I will go back to your comment that it was maybe at some point waste of time to explain that there were no green little men in the Crimea, but still, because of this overwhelming presence of Russian narratives outside Russia, outside Ukraine, in some Anglophone, let's say, countries. Sometimes, well, you do feel like you're wasting time again and again because you're repeating the same information about Ukraine and the Crimea and what happened there. So my question is how these two narratives can be somehow not combined, but at least how Ukrainian narrative can counteract the Russian narrative, and how we can position ourselves as probably in a more stronger position, because there are a lot of questions about Crimea being Russian, because it's one of the most powerful myths that Russia created and Russia supported, and they keep supporting this myth. And again, I'm going back to the 90s, where Crimea was presented very often in the Russian context, particularly when we talked about Russian writers. Crimea was presented as a place for Russian writers. And unfortunately, in the 90s, we didn't talk that much about Ukrainian writers who spent a lot of time in the Crimea. So again, it was one of those elements that contributed to this myth, which Russia is using and reusing again and again.
That won't be fixed fast. I had this question to Andres Kapeller, who is the Swiss historian and one of the first who started to research Ukrainian history in the end of in 70s, 60s. You know, he was one of the first. And for me was always the question, you know, why there is such a negative, generally, perception of Ukraine. The problem of that is, the answer was that is the challenge of the countries which has been occupied, or the countries, let's say, of the small states, and of the states which, you know, were the parts of the other states. So this lack of the knowledge overall about Ukraine was the reason why for centuries and decades, the Ukrainian history hadn't been learned, as well as for often like Czech history hasn't been learned, or Hungarian history had been learned. That is a problem of the small states and of the states which didn't have their state for a while. So in a way, we start to tell again about Ukraine, about Ukrainian history, and today as well about the Crimean Tatar history. What is this history? Because, you know, it sounds a marginal part. You know, you should be it's a very niche thing to study Crimean Tatars history. So in the end, that's why the Russian narrative is dominating, as always, the narrative of the biggest state. You will do nothing to say that Russia still will be always the biggest country globally. It's just because of its scale. So I do think that is very important. But again, I do not want to feel powerless, because when we think how much money had been spent by Russia to propaganda and everything, and how disproportional were, you know, our participation, how asymmetric it was. And I'm speaking about us, you know, independent journalists who were speaking without any budget, hundreds of initiatives which appeared without any budget, you know, or, you know, with a tiny, and we still manage, if we speak, so in the end, after that, if you compare, we should already forget about Crimea. However, we do not. So I do think we can counter that. And really, for me, the history of Crimea and the history of Ukraine, in where there will be place to Crimea, because it would explain, you know, how rivers were built, how settlements were created. That would be also a very, very important part, just to write the history of Ukraine, since, you know, where you consider this part of the land again. And I do think that that's an interesting issue, because in Ukrainian history book, traditionally also Crimean Tatars were portrayed as, you know, the people who were, you know, Tatars, who were maybe occupiers, who were from the other religion. I do think it's something how the ways you know, how did American history change, studying of the US history change from having Columbus as somebody who opened America, and how had you integrated the Native Americans history into the history book of the US? That's the homework of the Ukrainians, to do that. And when we do that, we really understand, we might be, challenged, not challenged, but explained how connected those territories are. That what and this is a very, very, very interesting story, again, to remember that this part of the land has a 2,000 years history.
Could you repeat one more time when you traveled last to the Crimea?
I traveled last time 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
In 2019.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's already 2 years ago. Time is running fast. No.
So, and we just had May 9th, which is widely celebrated in Russia, and it is presented as a Victory Day. And Crimea is always part of this huge celebration, and at least in the media space, we see pictures and we see videos portraying children who are wearing some uniforms from the Second World War, and they are used as instruments to, again, infiltrate this kind of attitude towards the war and towards the Crimea as a Russian place. So would you share with us your impressions on this issue?
I do remember that for me, there was also, I think it was the second year in 2016, when I went in particularly for the 9th of May, the Victory Day, and I went to Sevastopol. And there was really, really such a strange feeling of such a cute 2, 3, 5 years old kids all in the uniforms. Honestly saying, the kids are cute, but it's a bit horrible to see them in a military uniform, and the whole militarization process. There is such phenomenon as the Yun Army, the army for the youth, from where the kids out of the from the age of like 6 or 7 are accepted, so they train them as the young military. This organization is run by some astronaut from Russia, which is somewhere from Vladivostok. Why I'm remembering that? Because the one time I've been in Yalta, maybe it was the last time, and we've seen this ceremony of the accepting the kids who are in their 7 and years to this Yun Army, and you just think like, what this guy has to do with Crimea? It's 20,000 kilometers away, like 15,000 kilometers away. So this is the militarization, and indeed one of the things we also want to talk is another human rights violation, which is often missed, is a conscription of the youth in Crimea. According to the Geneva Convention, if there is an occupation, the occupying state do not conscript the people because there is a possibility they need to fight later against Ukrainians and others, and of course for occupying for population which is occupied, to serve for occupier. And if it's meant, that's a difficult thing, but it's happening. There were numerous calls to do something with that. It's still there. So yeah, it has its impact, and we cannot say that I should say that, of course, the 9th of May is a sad, it's a sad day. We're still challenging this, we're still living with the legacy of the Second World War and the Soviet perception of the way how you celebrate the end of the war, more like the victory of some abstract state, instead of remembering the humans, remembering the human loss and the human cost. So this is the part of the lesson to be learned, that the war should be remembered as a human tragedy, and the commemoration is about commemorating the people who passed, rather than just glorifying the military.
And probably we have time for one more question, and we have this question about environment protection. You mentioned that the area is highly militarized, and of course it entails a lot of problems for the environment. in addition to that, we have lack of water, which again is quite politicized, and the Russian side probably is hoping to use this as a leverage in some possible negotiations, which again are quite impossible for the Ukrainian side. So just maybe briefly, could you describe your observation of this problem in the Crimea during your last visit there? Because again, according to there is this problem with information which is available to those who cannot travel to the Crimea, and all we can rely on either some media sources or some other data which are presented by scholars. And again, here I don't want to start a different question, because scholars from Russia probably do have access to some data, particularly after 2014, but there is some ethical problem here, whether we can talk about Ukraine or about Crimea, which is not part of Russia. However, they do present sometimes in their surveys Crimea as de facto a Russian territory.
So as about environment, the big issue is water. What is important that, you know, there is enough of water for the civilian needs. The issue is about using the water for the industry and for the military. And as I also mentioned, this bringing of the changing of the, you know, bringing new people or to Crimea, the mass of those people. So in this regard, there is this discussion, you know, like, should Ukraine open the Crimean Channel? And Crimea is dependent on Ukrainian water. The whole nature, the whole landscape is that Crimea is the natural part of Ukraine. It really, despite it is peninsula, it depends on the water. It's just nature, it's just geography. So these shouldn't be two separate states. Yet, so there are this kind of type of the idea that, like, oh, so should Ukraine bring this this water because there is an artificial channel which is built? Again, as I said, like, if it was a humanitarian issue regarding the people, that would be the different thing. But now the problem is that, in particular, the way how the water is used by the currently occupying authorities. As I said, like, moving the some kind of water from the lake to the needs of the people in the towns. So, like, careless way to do that. So there should be better monitoring because, again, these are long-lasting environmental issues. I cannot say that Russia is a very, let's say, environmentally friendly place. For instance, apart from that, the issue is also about the building a lot of residential building and others in the places where there are natural resorts and things like that. So these are the things to follow. You know, we can complain that maybe, oh, Ukraine didn't build that much because they didn't have enough money, but building in the natural park, that's not something, you know, when you have money, but you build a sanatorium which belongs to some of the Russian oligarchs or a law enforcement officer who just wants to have his business. That's not about, you know, investment. Just given maybe one example, just to understand how the money invested are used. So we know the roads could be the problem in this part of the land. So there was a new road built from Sevastopol to Simferopol. But again, the people would say that, look, if it was built for the locals, there would be exit. But often there are no exit at this road for the population of those villages or some towns which are along this road. So the road is built for the people from one big town to another big town. Is it built carefully to serve the needs of the population? Not really. Like, Okay, you can have the Great Road, but what if you do not have an exit? What is the sense? So in this regard, that's why I'm thinking that you can't explain with the investment and financial input and have it an excuse to have those things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you so much for joining us for our series and for this opportunity today to speak about Crimea. Thank you.
Thank you, and please follow, read. There is way more interesting information in English, in German, available in Russian as well, if you do not speak Ukrainian. And thanks for organizing and the interest.
Today, we spoke with Natalia Gumenyuk, who presented on Lost Island, Why We Should Care More About Crimea. Thank you for attending our lecture. Information about our upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel, and for future recorded events, please subscribe to our channel. Again, thank you so much for attending our talk today.